The software is telling me, hello. The software is telling me that I'm live. I'm not entirely certain whether or not I am. Okay, it looks like we are good to go. Let me know in the chat if we are not. Hello and welcome to live streaming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today is not going to be the typical 2-hour thing with the presentation and Q&A at the end. The intention today is to go through what's going on in Kazakhstan right now to the extent that we can. It's rather difficult to know exactly what's going on, but I think the implications are big enough that it makes sense to try to unpack what's going on there right now and to explain things, at least to an extent. I think the first thing that's important to know about Kazakhstan is that it is a petrostate. And I think that that's probably the key thing for me and for the interests of this channel in analyzing what is happening in Kazakhstan, because this is something that I believe we're going to see more and more of. Even before COVID, the world was racked by a protest wave of dissatisfied folks. That is exacerbated by being in a petrostate, a country that is tremendously reliant on oil and gas resources. I believe Kazakhstan is something like the 11th or 12th biggest oil producer. It's a very poor country, or some would argue middle income, most would argue still quite poor. But oil resources have brought about an incredible transformation in the country since they came online in, I believe, 1993. Kazakhstan, of course, was part of this Russian Empire and then part of the Soviet Empire up until 1991. It very quickly became independent. It very quickly became more capable of asserting independence than many other of the stands because of the large oil and gas resources. It is debatable that may actually be ending today. That could be an overstatement, but there's definitely a shift in the quality of sovereignty that Kazakhstan enjoys. That's what's been going on. What's been going on specifically is since January 2nd, the place has erupted in a protest movement and has very quickly gone to yesterday chaos in the streets and today a Russian intervention under the guise of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the sort of Russian NATO. But as with NATO actions, it's really the main country, the Russia, that is the guiding force behind the CSTO and this intervention in Kazakhstan happening today. One of the aspects of Kazakhstan being a petrostate is that it is in a state of slow motion failure. Reporting on oil and gas resources is generally pretty bad. It tends to focus what's happened over the past day or so rather than what's been happening over the past years. And Kazakhstan is facing the same challenge that every other petrostate in the world has been facing since 2014. In the short term, in Europe especially, oil and gas prices are higher than they have been for much of the period over the past 7 years. However, even today, they are far below what they were back in 2014. Almost the entire period of Kazakhstan's independence, the 90s up until 2014, there were sort of accelerating returns, with ups and downs, of course, from oil and gas resources as more came on stream. What Kazakhstan has been dealing with, as with every other petrostate over the past 7 years, is a slowly constricting budget and a sort of slow motion building crisis as the amount of money that they used to think they had to be able to use is simply no longer available. So yeah, certainly right now, looking at this month or the past couple months, oil and gas prices in Europe and especially look very high, but along the long, whether prices spike for a month or two doesn't actually change the long-term story for Kazakhstan, which is shrinking budgets, shrinking availability of funds to bribe the people, And unfortunately, in Kazakhstan's case, and a lot of other petrostates, mostly for massive corruption, which of course means that now even if you've got a petrostate that's running out of money, you have parts of the ruling class that start to be losing out, and I think that has something to do with what we're seeing in Kazakhstan. But the impetus, the reason that this all started on January 2nd was because the Kazakh government removed some price controls or stopped supporting a lower price for gas, which obviously a lot of Kazakhs, as a petrostate, expect an entitlement to lower gas prices. But as is the case with most petrostates right now, they can't afford the historic privileges any longer. And as what was probably billed as a positive, help the budget kind of measure, they decided to allow the prices to rise, and that sparked a protest movement. I think it's important to emphasize, I'm going to get into a lot of geopolitical sort of conspiracizing or what have you, mostly just speculation. We do not know. We emphatically do not know what's going on right now. I'll suggest a couple scenarios. But it is important to emphasize with this next point, and with this petrostate point, is that there are extremely large legitimate grievances that the Kazakh government has against its Kazakh people have against the Kazakh government. It has been, it's kind of interesting because I've considered Kazakhstan like sort of the best run of the stands of these countries, these post-Soviet countries to the east. Of the stands, Kazakhstan is probably the best run, but that says absolutely nothing. There have been some of the most insane strongmen of modern history have been found over the past 30 years in these countries, in the stands, more broadly speaking. Nursultan Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan from 1990 until, I believe, mostly voluntary retirement in 2019, was certainly a personality cult strongman, but not as bad as most of the personality cult strongmen that we find in Kazakhstan, like marginally better. That means that there is an education system in Kazakhstan that is better than everywhere else in the stands. Again, we're grading on an extremely low curve where we're sort of leaping. So Nazarbayev is generally seen to have leaped the incredibly low bar towards being one of the better strongmen in the stands. He handed off power in 2019 to Kasim Jomart Tokayev. It's important to emphasize that, yes, there was some positive aspects of Kazakhstan compared to other governments, but it was extraordinarily corrupt. There were some crumbs. There were more crumbs that fell off the table for the Kazakh people than in other stands and in some other petrostates. But the people absolutely have a very legitimate grievance over what has been done to them over the past 30 years. So I think it's important to emphasize that it's not surprising that there is a legitimate anger here and legitimate uprising, and that should not be minimized. However, just the extreme timeline here, that was going to be my main message, sort of closing that. But the timeline here is just the protests started on January 2nd. 3 days later, yesterday, they dissolved into violence. We're now getting a body count of dozens, is what we've been told. And now on January 6th, the Russian troops, with some support from other countries in the CSTO, are on the ground. And just the speed with which that worked is honestly quite... It's hard to look at that and not think that the Russians were ready for this to some extent. I know that sounds... I'm not committing to that for sure, but man, that timeline is pretty quick. That's a pretty quick turnaround. It's unclear what is actually happening on the ground. The president, the successor to Nazarbayev, appears to have fired most of his government, and also supposedly dislodged Nazarbayev himself, the old long-term strongman, from his position as the head of the Security Council of Kazakhstan, which was sort of his, presumably his retirement position from which he could still exert power. And he has been apparently kicked out of that. We're seeing his statues falling. But what exactly any of this means is anybody's guess. As I'd emphasized, Kazakhstan is a very corrupt place with involvement of its own oligarchs, other countries' oligarchs, Russia's oligarchs, Ukraine's oligarchs. And what exactly is happening, who has taken, hijacked these protests to make them super violent, and to what ends, all we have here is speculation. We just do not know. What we do know is that the Russians were spectacularly prepared for this, and that they have acted in ways that I believe really shore up their claims for regional hegemony and their sort of geopolitical footprint. What is, I think, worth looking at here is sort of the state of affairs on all of the post-Soviet countries. All of these, this is still drawn from a video I did that I posted on the community page talking about Russia's hidden victory in the Caucasus. So these are all, I'm sure there's something wrong on this map. There often are things wrong on my map. But these are all the post-Soviet republics. And in the West, I think it's pretty clear that Putin and Russia have lost, and lost big. The Baltics are, generally happy, prosperous countries within NATO and the European Union now. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Belarus is a basket case with not very many people. Ukraine is a large country of 40 million people that is really angry at Russia, I think is fair to say, and the majority not going well in the West. As I pointed out in that video on the community page you can check out, Russia kind of won in the center, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. This is something that I think is underreported from last fall, or rather, I guess it was the fall of 2020. Basically, Russia used the Armenia and Azerbaijan war to reoccupy two post-Soviet republics, and they also already have garrisoning some exclaves, some breakaway territories of Georgia. So yeah, they've sort of pretty much completed their retaking of the Caucasus, as far as I'm concerned. And I had previously thought that they were losing ground in the east to China, and that is not what the world looks like today, when we've got Russian troops at Kazakh airports. Importantly, apparently, because of the invitation of current president of Kazakhstan, President Tokayev. What this means, nobody knows. I think there's a lot to be said about ways that Ukrainian organized crime or Russian organized crime or oligarchs or of either of those countries, what's honestly the difference, could have influence on what's happening in Kazakhstan. But it's also important to recognize that what we're definitely seeing in Kazakhstan is a battle between its own oligarchs and its own centers of power, attempts to sort out who's going to be the next guy in charge. I'd seen some speculation that perhaps Nazarbayev isn't even really being thrown out. Maybe he'd become incapacitated for some reason. He is a very old man, and this is just, what's shaking out. I don't know. That's just speculation. But we are absolutely, I believe, seeing a struggle for power within Kazakhstan. And that is also, I believe, a side effect of being a failing petrostate. If you don't have as many resources to share around anymore, the public starts to suffer, but also some of the winners, the other oligarchs in the society. We saw this in Saudi Arabia. One of the somewhat successful at this point strategies that MBS has used to stay in power is to dispossess a lot of the other members of the Saudi royal family and just wealthy Saudis, famously by holding them all in the Ritz-Carlton and I believe somewhere in Saudi Arabia, and in some cases torturing folks until they gave up their wealth. I think this is obviously a very different situation in Kazakhstan, but I would imagine as the spoils are diminishing, as there is less money to go around in a petrostate that is running out of resources, and yes, there's still plenty of money slopping around, as with Saudi Arabia. This is a slow process, but it is a process that is happening. So it's important to emphasize that as much manipulation as may be occurring from the outside, this is also taking advantage of many stresses within Kazakhstan. So it's really hard to say what's happening in there. But what is not hard to say is that the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, dates back to the late 90s, which is basically Russia and a bunch of stands and perhaps some other countries. I should have looked into that. Was something that was sort of broadly seen as none too serious. It's sort of Russia's half-assed sad sack attempts to counter NATO. As of this morning, it looks very serious. It looks very real. And it's sort of a very ironic turn of events. The Armenian Prime Minister, Pashinyan, was holding the chair of the CSTO or something along those lines, sort of a rotating head. And it was actually Pashinyan that first announced the intervention of CSTO, mostly Russian, troops into Kazakhstan. This is especially strange because Pashinyan has been trying to get Russia to intervene in Armenian and Azeri border disputes in the name of the CSTO, specifically for the past 3 or 4 months or so, and really for a year and a half. He really wanted his CSTO status to help Armenia hold on to occupied territory within Azerbaijan, which Russia did not do. But there's a certain bitter irony in Pashinyan announcing the first real exertion of CSTO power. This is, I believe, a humiliation for Turkey, probably more than anything else. Turkey loves to talk about its natural affinities with Turkic countries, which are based on very, very real linguistic, not so much, I think, genetic anymore, but really very real linguistic connections. There's an arc of Turkic peoples going from Turkey, going from the border of Greece all the way up into Xinjiang, which is formerly, at some points by some, known as East Turkestan. So the Xinjiang province of China all the way to the border of Greece is a broader Turkic world. And the leaders of Turkey for decades now, actually probably a full century, have talked a very big game about how they have this natural leadership of the Turkic world and attempt to assert some kind of soft and occasionally hard power. Certainly there was a lot of talk about how Turkey was helping Azerbaijan take back territory from the Armenians in the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in the fall of 2020. But both in Azerbaijan and Armenia, and now also in Kazakhstan, this is another traditionally Turkic people. It was interesting. I was reading some Kazakh, attempting to read some Kazakh for the first time, and I have very bad Turkish, but I could sort of piece out some of the words in the way that it is written, and so there is a real affinity there, and Turkey and Erdogan, of course, has. In his own mind and in the mind of many of his followers, has made this old commitment, this age-old commitment to Turkic solidarity more real with Azerbaijan, and to see Russia hopping in to sort of sort out these issues in the post-Soviet Turkic Republic of Kazakhstan is, I believe, a little humiliating to Turkey. It makes. I have talked on this channel about the idea of a Russo-Turkish Cold War. And while I believe that's very real in the Middle East, where there's some serious competition, similarity of access to Syria and Libya. Arguably, even the Turks really won out in Libya. In the post-Soviet republics, I think we can now confidently say that is not the case. And Turkey has gotten sort of smacked around both in the Caucasus and now in Kazakhstan. I do believe this is. I totally, with the short this morning, talked about how has China lost Kazakhstan to Russia. I believe that this is absolutely a sort of smack in the face for China as well. A lot of folks have pushed back, and I do believe that. Obviously, I was being a little trolly this morning, and as expected, that video is already blowing up on TikTok. But I do believe this is a bit of a come down for China. Yes, China focuses more on the economic. Yes, China, can probably do much of the business it was already doing under a Kazakhstan that's more firmly back under in Russia's column. But it is, I mean, the whole point of a lot of Chinese posturing under Xi Jinping is to convince the world that they are a big deal, they matter in their near abroad. And what this means, what this could mean, I'll get to what this actually means for vis-a-vis Russia and Kazakhstan next, but if we are truly seeing a reassertion of Russian power in Kazakhstan, this means that Russia and China have a long border again. And this is a real come down for obviously the Taiwan issue is much more important, much more different, much more salient for the Chinese government than whatever happens to Kazakhstan. But as a broad geopolitical principle, this is a place on China's border that is falling into chaos and getting sorted out by the Russians. And so far, I haven't heard a thing from the Chinese. Presumably, there'll be some statement sort of endorsing Russia's sort of fait accompli at some point over the next day or so. But yeah, I mean, Russia and China, fought border wars, small border wars in the 60s. And the possibility of them sharing a border in some ways again is quite something. To speak about that question, so yeah, Russia's treaty organization, the CSTO, is now in Kazakhstan. What does that actually mean? Who knows? But even if it is the lightest possible footprint, I would argue, even if it is the lightest possible footprint, even if it is just going to be they're going to occupy some airports until things look a little more calm and Tokayev is firmly ensconced back in power and then they pull out again. Even if that's everything this means, this is still a tremendous exertion of Russian power and a victory for Putin. Because it makes the CSTO real. It makes it something that actually exerts power in Russia's near abroad, makes it something that actually serves Russian goals of stability. And honestly makes it look a hell of a lot more useful than NATO, which seems to mostly, blow up African countries like Libya and rob all of North Africa of a decade of growth, or murder children in Afghanistan. Unlike NATO, it seems like the CSTO is actually an organization that serves its main client, Russia, to a degree, and it looks real. So there's no telling what's going to happen from here. There's no telling. I think I should mention it depends on one's interpretation of what's happening here, whether this is tremendously useful for Ukraine or not. If this truly did come up out of nowhere and has the potential of spiraling into a broader civil war in Kazakhstan that Russia could get caught up in, then yes, this looks very good for Ukraine. There was a tweet going around talking about how the Kazakh oligarch who's attempting to put himself in charge of the rebel forces, exiled Kazakh oligarch, mostly has Ukrainian phone numbers. There are absolutely Ukrainian forces, organized crime, oligarchs, what have you, who could have potentially played a role in fomenting this. But that is just as much speculation as the idea that Russia is behind this. We just don't know. That is possible. And yeah, it's possible that Russia will get bogged down in this. We'll have to commit more forces. We'll then decide that, the whole Ukraine adventure that many folks were confident that Russia was about to embark on just isn't worth it, is too much of a division of forces. Who knows? We'll see. On the flip side, well, looking at that timeline and just how quickly Russia was available to do this, a lot of people have said, well, it's really fucking stupid for Russia to invade Ukraine if they've been forecasting it and telling everybody they're going to do it for 2 months. That's really silly, so they're not going to do it. Well, then maybe if this really is all a Russian show, then maybe they're making a big show of committing resources to Kazakhstan without really doing so, and maybe they control things on the ground in some subtle way we haven't thought of. And maybe this is a diversion, so everyone focuses on this for a day or two while Russia makes its move in Ukraine. That's possible too. Alternatively, it could be that Russia is happy that this is happening, or is simply just taking advantage of this opportunity because it allows them to back down over Ukraine a bit. Arguing that, well, the stability of the region requires us as good stewards of stability and peace to help out in Kazakhstan before we settle these strategic issues in Ukraine. So I think a lot of it is basically, a lot of what we have to say today about what's going on in Kazakhstan is, I don't know. But I hope that this presentation was helpful. That's most of what I wanted to say. Why don't, have we got any, if we've got any questions either on TikTok or YouTube that are about Kazakhstan, I can do that for a minute or two. Yeah, Ahmad J.I. says, plot twist, Kazakhstan is keeping Russia busy so Ukraine can strike back. That is totally a plausible interpretation. I don't know. Nobody knows. Anybody who's confident, there are going to be a lot of people on Twitter and elsewhere who are going to say that very confidently that this is the Ukrainians, or this is the Americans, or this is the Russians, or this is the other person. And basically, you shouldn't trust any of that because we just don't know at this point. We just don't know. As Six-Pack American says, the Turks are not so strong as their propaganda suggests. Yeah, that's very true. I mean, we're certainly watching their currency fall apart. That's been stabilized. But yeah, I mean, the Turkish economy is a mess. Turkey is overcommitted, and their supposed power with their supposed commitments to their Turkic brothers all over the world is looking a lot more dubious and a lot less important. Do you think the U.S. is trying to put a wedge between the Sino-Russian relation? I don't think this is the U.S. I'll be honest. I don't think we have that kind of competence. I wouldn't be surprised at all if there was some dumbass, elements of the, I don't know, the what's the National Democratic Institute, or some like CIA element that were like, oh yeah, we're gonna try to piggyback on these protests too. But I think what's much more plausible is that we're seeing Ukrainian or Russian or just plain Kazakh oligarchs and organized crime fight it out. I think that's much more plausible. I just think, I don't. As I've said before, I don't see the CIA as a particularly credible or competent actor really anywhere. I hope that answered your question, Lands167. Sorry, this question isn't related to the Kazakhstan situation. I'm not gonna. I'm just gonna talk about Kazakhstan. we do one of these things live every month, and I do a solid hour and a half of Q&A. But I want to keep this one short, so people might actually watch it. Low Cool Extreme asks, what are the chances DC has a role in these protests, or do I sound like a Kremlin lackey? No, you don't sound like a Kremlin lackey. It makes perfect sense to think about and propose possibilities of all kinds of sinister plots from all kinds of countries. I mean, this is the post-Soviet world, and as most will tell you, it's often even worse than you imagine. As you know, I would argue the U.S. government is a lot worse than most people imagine in terms of how stupid it is. You know, there was that "Don't Look Up" film that came out, and everyone was sort of talking about how it was too on the nose satire. And I was like, honestly, doesn't seem like satire. That seems like an honest recounting of how U.S. foreign policy is made. Asking, do you think the new special envoy of the United States for the Horn of Africa will make any difference? Probably not. That is not a Kazakhstan question. What is the best and worst thing DC could do right now? That's a great question, I think, from Logan, and that's a great question to close with. I don't know what the U.S. reaction is going to be right now. I was very surprised the complete lack of reaction that the U.S. had to Russia basically winning in the Caucasus in the fall of 2020. I mean, I put a video on the community page on my YouTube channel that calls it Russia's hidden victory, because I mean, it's transparently obvious that Russia won in the Caucasus with Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, but nobody talks about it. And I kind of wonder if, you know, the Kazakhstan thing, there's a chance that it'll be like that. The Kazakhstan thing for the U.S. will be sort of covered half-assedly. There'll be some infuriated tweets. And I mean, certainly even more than the Caucasus, it's sort of like, what exactly can the U.S. do here? We absolutely have oil companies present in Kazakhstan, big major U.S. oil companies. I think Chevron and Exxon sticks in my head. But Kazakh oil is, I think, fairly easy to extract, but it's very far away from markets. It's becoming less useful. Yeah, I kind of, and who knows? It could be anything between the U.S. just sort of, moves on to the next problem 3 days from now, or we could make a huge stink over it. I just don't know. We haven't heard much from, Blinken's apparently talking to the foreign minister. Is he a brand new foreign minister for Kazakhstan? I don't know. It's all up in the air. I think the United States has very clear approaches and opinions about a sort of small subset of places, and Ukraine, unfortunately, became one of those places. But I don't know. Could we see just sort of Ethiopia level from the U.S., which is definitely, it's better to see a U.S. admitting that it has no idea what's going on than a U.S. Desperately attempting to control everything. So I just don't know. We're still up in the air, but I thought it might be useful to do sort of a refresher course for Kazakhstan and the issues there as I see them. I do see this as a huge Russian victory already. No telling what happens from here, but I thought it was worth talking about. And I think with that, I'm going to close this. You can find me on YouTube at Mo Freedom Foundation, on TikTok at More Freedom Foundation. You can find me on Twitter at Robbo Law. I've written some fun books. They're linked in I think one of them is linked in the description here. If you sign up on Patreon, you get to join us on Discord, where I developed a lot of the arguments for this live chat. Thank you so much for joining me today. And of course, we should think of the people of Kazakhstan who've been much abused for 30 years, and some of whom probably had a few minutes, a day or two of hope before it became clear that, their cities were going to get destroyed. We're already seeing, this is already something of a mass death event. So I guess, hopes and prayers, if you're into that, for the Kazakh people, that they make it through this. And with that, I'm going to end the stream. Thank you all for being here.